Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar, Including Students on the Spectrum, 5 Powerful Strategies, presented by Dr. Paula Kluth. My name is Sharon Larkin. I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at Brooks Publishing, who is the sponsor for today's webinar. I have to say, if you have never had the opportunity to attend a Paula Kluth presentation, you are in for a very, very big treat today. I can't stop smiling. I'm so excited that you are here. So again, if you're not already a member, we would love for you to be a member. You can have access, by being a member, you can get access to webinars like this one. And also we have special content and offers that we put on there. So if you just go to Teaching All Students, you can join that. And we do also have a special offer. We're offering 20% off at brookspublishing.com. Just use code EDW219. This offer excludes our trainings and any pre-discounted items, but it is good on everything else, including Paula Kluth's books. Which brings us to today's giveaway. We are doing a special giveaway. 3 winners will receive a copy of Paula's You're Gonna Love This Kid, 2nd edition. We will select you at random, and then we will announce the winners at the end of today's webinar. So without any further delay, I am so excited to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Paula Kluth. Dr. Kluth is a consultant. She is a best-selling author, an advocate, an independent scholar who works with teachers and families to provide inclusive opportunities for students with disabilities and to create more responsive and engaging schooling experience for all learners. She is a former special educator who has served as a classroom teacher and an inclusion facilitator. Her professional interests includes differentiating instruction and inclusive schooling. So Paula, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate it. And I am really honored to be here. But now I'm sort of nervous because I'm watching these comments, which is really fun. But I'm seeing all kinds of wonderful advocates and colleagues that I know, friends of mine. So thank you to all of my friends. I'm seeing folks from Canada and Australia and Asia. It's really exciting. And a special shout out to my teacher friends in Green Bay, where I'm from. What's so cool about seeing that is that it's so clear from looking at who is attending and who oftentimes does attend these kinds of workshops. It's folks that are doing the work. They're committed to this, taking oftentimes your own time. So I really appreciate that. Some of you may know I wrote a book called Don't We Already Do Inclusion? And when people hear about that title, they always say, oh, does she think that we're not, doing, what does she mean by that? When people say to me, I show up on their campus and they say, what are you doing here again? Don't we already do this? Didn't we already have you here? And I always say, oh, yeah. I mean, most folks are doing such a lovely job supporting kids. And I know that the reason we see so many newer and veteran teachers on these calls is because teachers always just have a passion for learning more. And that just makes my teacher heart swell and grow. I love it. This is, 1 hour, and I thought, what can I do in just this 1 hour time frame? And maybe a more savvy person would have tried to have just a few points, but I'm trying to jam a lot in because I thought, what if somebody really needs that one point that I leave out? So I'm going to try to share with you 5 big ideas, 5 big strategies, a little bit of research as well. And I also want to talk just a bit about some resources that you can get when we're not on this call anymore and how you can do your own PD right where you are. All right. So is this, now Sharon, I think I've already messed up. Am I just advancing with the arrows here?
Yep, just advance with the arrows.
There we go. Okay, I did the wrong arrow. There we go. Okay, so for those of you that have not heard me tell the story, I've been telling it for as many years as I've been presenting. The title of the book that Sharon was featuring, You're Gonna Love This Kid, is really based on something that happened to me. It's a story about my first years as a school teacher and about my work supporting kids, in particular kids that maybe have a few more needs. And just to kind of tell the short story that's associated with that, I had a student who, when I was first learning about him, before I even laid eyes on him, I was hearing all these stories about him, and I was hearing all of these descriptors of him, and the descriptors were not necessarily positive. And you probably know some of those descriptors yourselves. You've seen them. So that he was non-compliant, that peers avoided him, that he was, often off task, that he was hyper, and that he was an eloper. I always say when I hear that, I don't know what to say. Eloper, that sounds romantic to me. That's not even something I can feel upset about. I don't even know really what that means. I think it means that sometimes, kids are really active, right? And so as I'm reading through this, I'm feeling really intimidated and, quite frankly, a little bit demoralized. And the fun ending of the story is that I had a great administrator, Dr. Patrick Schwartz, who had a very different way of conceptualizing not only the work, but this individual. And he essentially pulled me aside and said, you're going to love this kid. This kid's really great, and started sharing with me all these fantastic attributes, including that the child could not sit for, maybe 5 minutes at a time, but could do so for maybe 3 or 4 minutes at a time. And that he was able to do that quite a few times over the course of a day. And really pointing out that if you look towards the positive, especially for somebody that has a lot of needs, it doesn't make the behavior maybe any different, but it can help you find the solution quicker. And he talked about some of the things that he liked, and that he liked books and he liked horses, and some of the skills that he already had, and how he was accessing some informal ways of communicating. And so I wrote that book, You're Going to Love This Kid, as an homage to not only my boss, but also as a way to challenge maybe at the time what was a more common way of thinking about kids, all kids with disabilities in some cases, but in particular kids on the spectrum, where we tended to be very deficit oriented. So everything I'm going to share with you today is kind of based on student-centered supports. How do we, not necessarily coercive supports, how do we get kids to do what we want them to do? But when I would go into a situation where somebody's struggling, what are the things that I would look at? And I would try to check these things off first. So the first thing that I want to share with you is just this language as a tool. This isn't one of the 5 ideas, but when you are constantly seeing, the language that is deficit oriented, so he can't and he won't and he doesn't, that realizing that just changing the language. So I'll give you an example of that. I'm going to talk in a little bit about using fascinations and interests as a way to support students. And so one of the easier transitions I think that can be made is by talking about fascinations instead of obsessions. Just kind of playing with that language and saying, if we talked about kids differently, if we really explored, I always say the house that we build for kids, what does the space feel like? Sometimes that's as powerful a strategy as any. So think first about, what kind of language are we using to describe our learners? And I always say, when you think about the deficit model, it's oftentimes, not only is it oftentimes not very nice, but oftentimes it's not helpful. And I think that's something we'll be exploring here and thinking about the strategies. So what if we looked for strategies that are kid-centered, and what if we looked for strategies that built on meeting students where they are? So to that end, the very first idea is to check curriculum and interrogate instruction. So this seems like it's so big and broad that it may seem elusive to try to use this as a strategy. But what I mean by that is that when I'm going into classrooms, and especially around behavior, but around learning as well, it's not so much about how do we motivate somebody with something that may be an add-on, like a system, chart, that kind of thing. But I look at, what are we asking this person to do every day, and would I do it? That's one of the markers I use. Would I do this all day? Is this interesting? Is it meaningful? Is it motivating? Is it connected to other kids? Is there any element of novelty in this work? Are my interests expected any time in the day, the week, the month, or the year? So really thinking about curriculum and instruction as a super powerful tool. And I just want to go through a list of things that I see that can be problematic, that can be troublesome. For example, curriculum that lacks variety. Even in inclusive classrooms, this is more common than you might think, so that where everybody else during a language arts lesson might be rotating to different stations or centers, I sometimes see students with disabilities who might be going through the same, set of flashcards or using the same kinds of apps repeatedly. Is the curriculum age appropriate? Is this the kinds of materials that kids his age would be accessing? Or is it something that's maybe for a much younger student? Is it a good match for his or her learning preference? So if a student is being asked to do a lot of writing, I think this is less common today with all of our technology, but for a lot of kids, when they have to physically write, even if it's just, filling in something on a worksheet or doing a very quick exit slip, handwriting can be very oppressive for kids. And I remember a colleague telling me that, I think this was my colleague, Mayor Shevin, that he said for a lot of kids when they write, it's like chiseling something out of stone, that the motor planning is such a severe hurdle that we need to really look at other methods. If there's not a lot of communication and choice making in the day, so, if you have a young child, are they getting to, maybe if during your morning meeting, having a chart where somebody can come up and choose which song we're going to sing. That choice making isn't just about yes, no, bathroom, sorry. It's not just about some of those ways of engineering the day, that we're connecting communication systems and opportunities to learning, to standards. That for an older student, that we are letting them potentially, choose which, what's to talk about, which part of the novel that we should explore, or even if it's just an errorless choice, to talk about which one of these symbols we should examine first. So thinking about places where we can put those opportunities front and center and make sure we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, sometimes we bring students into our classrooms, our general ed classrooms, but we forget that they need plenty of practice on communication systems, and that they need social practice, and that they need literacy practice, and so on. Not enough social interaction in the day. So even though you may be in an inclusive classroom, are they getting to interact with other students? Are they having some comfortable ways of doing that if it's not terribly comfortable to do so? So one of the recommendations I often make is to, some folks will say, well, we sometimes let kids choose their own groups. Should we let them choose their own groups? And I always say it can be helpful in some juncture, beginning of the year or even midway through, like we are now. Ask kids who they like to work with and why, and let them make some choices, and then let the teacher, based on their feedback, so they still get to give some input, then we get to make some of those, create some of those constellations, so that students maybe on the autism spectrum don't have to figure out how to navigate those those social interactions while they're just in the midst of a math lesson or something. And then also not enough fun or joy in the day. So what does the instruction look like? Would you do this all day? Is this connect? And let's add to that, how much of my day is mediated? This is another big one. So if you have paraprofessional support, and we could not make most of our inclusive classrooms work without paraprofessional support in our schools and classrooms, but teachers, are we giving enough great guidance so that paraprofessionals know what to do when students have the ability to work with independently or interdependently? So can we use folks as classroom assistants and have them maybe take a few steps away from kids so that learners can be interacting in a more typical way with their peers? And when there's always a shadow, whether that be a teacher, therapist, or paraprofessional, that can be super overwhelming on a student and create a very different developmental experience for somebody. It's not how other kids experience the day. And so we want to make sure that we're assessing that too. How much does a student have some of that unmediated moments as a way of being in the classroom? Okay, so let's look at a little film clip because I want to add something. I want to add this element of, are we adapting standards properly? And what I mean by this, before we see the video, it's a little video clip from a movie, a DVD kit, a professional development kit that's connected to the book. So it's got the same name as the book. You can see the citation below. This little clip shows some materials and a teacher talking, my friend Sheila, talking about how we might think differently about kids being in classrooms and general education classrooms. And what I see again and again is if we don't set some adapted standards, if we don't understand what success looks like for a 6th grader in that environment, or an 8th grader in that mathematics class, or an 11th grader that's taking that film studies class, they may not be, it may not be appropriate for that kid to be hitting every one of the targets that his or her general ed peers are hitting. They may have different goals or objectives, different but related. And if general ed teachers and special ed teachers, quite frankly, and our therapists don't understand what those adaptive targets are, it's very hard for them to create the appropriate materials for those lessons. And then we don't know where to point our assessments. And therefore, a lot of our general ed folks, our parents, they think, well, this environment's not appropriate for the person because, as you can see, he's not keeping up. And keeping up for many of our kids is not the particular goal, in some instances for some kids in some classrooms. So let's take a look.
It's imperative that teachers individualize objectives and standards for different learners in the classroom. Not every student is going to learn every piece of the curriculum in the same way. So teachers need to be mindful about how different students will not only learn the content, but be thinking about what they'll be taking away.
When you're looking at state standards, and what does that look like for students with disabilities, particularly as kids get older? You know, now you're in 6th grade and your academic level doesn't quite look like 6th grade. What can you do? In 6th grade this year, what I did was I'll take the unit plan and then have a discussion with the teacher about what things do I want my students to learn.
And it's not like for disabilities, it will look like this. If you have 3 children on the spectrum, it could look different for all 3 students.
What I like to see around curriculum and instruction is that teachers have thought beforehand about all of their learners in their classroom, and how when each learner walks through that door, what is the student who doesn't know English very well that day? What are they going to do? Did you think about that ahead of time? When the student who uses the wheelchair comes through the door, have you thought about what are they going to do to participate in that lesson that day? And that's what makes teaching much more of a science and an art today than it was 25 years ago, where everyone did the same thing on page 25, and if the student could participate in it, great, and if they couldn't, they had to go somewhere to try to get caught up in whatever was being covered that day. And when you see it, you feel it. You can feel it, the energy in the room. You're not going to see the head down. You're not going to see, 3 kids clumped in the back of the room with a paraprofessional. You won't see that because that's been thought about ahead of time, and that all kids were accepted by that teacher ahead of time for their talents and gifts, and are allowed to do what they can and are challenged accordingly.
Okay, so hopefully that's helpful in thinking about the ways that we are assessing our learners. Really thinking about, do I have a student right now where it's hard for folks to see, the appropriateness of inclusion because it's not clear to stakeholders what success specifically looks like for this individual. And so it might be that we need to say, for this particular learner, that they are expected with a graphic organizer to write a paragraph that is argumentative, but for other students, they may be writing several papers throughout the course of the year. Some students may be able to, create their own, create the text with a partner around and be able to illustrate what is setting and plot. And other students may just have to identify and name, and may have to have collaborative partners to participate in those and have a different standard altogether. So they may not have to generate it, but they may be identifying or naming, for instance. Some students may be working on mastering certain IEP objectives alongside of academic content goals. So you may have a learner, for instance, who's in a science classroom, and they are working not only on being able to in a social studies classroom, they may be able to talk about what civil rights are and identify potential beliefs related to the civil rights movement, but they may at the same time be accessing an augmentative communication device to answer some questions about the civil rights movement. And we are looking at the success not only on the material itself, but on students' success in learning new skills with their communication devices or systems. So some teachers may not understand that, yeah, when we are able to connect those IEP objectives link those into our standards-based learning, that is part of how we are assessing success for some of our students. And that it is the best place for kids to learn communication and social skills and cross-curricular literacy skills is in the context of standards-based instruction. But we have to be able to show that kids can grow in those ways. We have to be able to take data in those ways. We have to connect those particular experiences to the IEP, and we have to be able to show the evidence to everyone that's involved in planning for that individual's educational program. So that's just one, a piece of the puzzle here, obviously, but I think it's the most important one to look at first. Now let's take a look at a few things that are a little bit less open-ended, I guess. Show and tell is the next, and I wanted to put this in particular because one of the things I see a lot in inclusive classrooms is that there are a lot of visuals for kids on the autism spectrum. It is almost this is different than 20 years ago. Oftentimes you don't have to say anything. You walk in and there will be a schedule or a picture schedule for a kid. There will probably be a first then board. There probably is a social story. However, what I see less of are visuals that are connected to academic learning and to the goals of inclusive education. So one of the reflections that you might have in watching this webinar is, how many visuals are we using for kids that are included? And are the visuals, how many of them are connected to our learning standards or to kids achieving goals inside inclusive classrooms? So here's an example right here. This is a student who has what we call this is from a book I did with my friend Sheila Danaher called From Tutor Scripts to Talking Sticks, and we call it the See Me Strong book. But this is a kid included inside physical education classroom who is really struggling a lot and isn't having a lot of opportunities to maybe access visuals that are specific to those objectives. So maybe the paraprofessional is using visuals to help her understand, how to calm herself or telling her what's next in the day. But the teacher made this great, almost like a social story type of book where it not only had the social story on the left, but on the right had images of the child participating in specific units in her inclusive physical education classroom. So to me, this is the difference, kind of the difference between thinking about just visuals to support kids in those classrooms and visuals that are connected to the standards in general ed. So she could look and see the next page would be basketball. There was one on juggling, so that when she hit those different units, she could look and she could see herself strong, almost like, when we think about video modeling, but this is a more static look at that. So that's one possibility. What are some repeating structures in your general education classrooms? If you work with young kids, it might be something about what do you offer at different stations or different centers. And you could make something like this even for an older kid, as we look at the physical education example for a kid doing circuit training in high school. So think about what is it that you are teaching? What are kids struggling to learn? And are you using those supports to meet those goals? Let's look at another one. This is a protocol book, and it is designed for a kid. This is from Text Maps to Memory Caps, which is the sister book to the one I mentioned earlier. And what you're using this for is to help kids navigate a space. So many of our kids need to know, what are the rules? What am I supposed to do here? What am I doing next? And it becomes really overwhelming if you don't have that information. In this classroom, these protocol books were not used just for kids with disabilities. They could be accessed by anybody. So as a lot of teachers you're bombarded not only in the beginning of the year, but throughout the year of kids asking, what do I do if I'm absent? How do I take a book out of the classroom library? What is the peer editing process supposed to look like? You might have to remind kids around some of those things. So you can have a visual protocol of any routine in a classroom. And in this particular classroom, there were 2 kids on the autism spectrum, and both of them would check this protocol book out as one of their options for independent reading because it was so soothing, kind of so inspiring, if you will. And your protocol book could have any kind of repeating routine that you want students to get information around. And the visual is really helpful in that, again, for kids with and without disabilities, where's that homework basket? And what do you mean by accessing which folder on the computer, so that you can actually show what that looks like. It's a management tool and it's a visual that will help kids navigate specifically the inclusive classroom. Here's another one. Thinking about adding simple things like handheld announcements. I have used these in my own professional development. It's a little bit different. And when we talk about novelty, it tends to get the attention of folks in a different way than what's up on the screen. So we're really used to paying attention to that screen. I also think that it's kind of humorous, to walk around with these little signs. So I always say it's fun to have, if you're co-teaching or if you have a paraprofessional, you are a paraprofessional, to make these for even teachers, kind of holding them up, hand in your homework here, and somebody else can have, or over here. You can use humor, good morning, and somebody else might have, hope you had a great night. So it can be humorous, but for a lot of kids, when kids are little, we tend to use the little stop sign at the door. We use these tools a lot, but they actually are really helpful as students get older as well. And sometimes with older kids in middle school and high school, they may want to make these beautiful visuals for you. And so think about the things that you want to communicate. If you are using stations in your 8th grade social studies classroom on a weekly basis, you may want to have some handheld announcements that you can walk around the room and let kids know 5 more minutes. You might want to walk around the room and let kids know, bring your voices down, whatever might kind of grab their attention in a slightly different way. And also you can hand these over to students and to paras and therapists, whoever happens to be working in your classroom and want to help out. And then very similarly, visual directions. And again, what I'm hoping that you're paying attention to here is that these are examples that are not just connected to kids navigating the school environment or the day. These are very specifically connected to curriculum. So we want to look for, how do we use this strategy that can be powerful and very UDL based? We know that we want to have multiple modes of representation in a universally designed classroom. Here we have, the visual directions, and it could be for anything. The steps of a business letter, if you're teaching high school business ed, that won't hurt anybody else, but it may really help kids with disabilities, kids on the autism spectrum. So you could have any kind of sequence, any number of steps that you, especially during the course of a unit where you're teaching something. So really think about, I'm already using that to help kids navigate the day or to help kids turn in homework. How can I now connect this to my content? How could I help them now think about this as a way to check in with their book clubs? Is there a way to use this as students, I was just working in a classroom where students were learning about how to find a book that was the right, kind of like the book that's just right for their reading level or interest. So when you think about this, when you get to lab, how do you handle some of that equipment? Any of that might be helpful. But again, specifically, hopefully some of you are just writing some ideas down. How can we think about these tools that we use very commonly and now take that into our curriculum and instruction in general ed? All right. The last one, I want to give you a little cheat here. This is checklists, and a lot of us, love these. I know I'm not the only one that loves a good checklist. So think about what are some of the routines that our students go through all the time, whether it's a term paper, it may be having to, I was just in a classroom the other day and they had to go through a whole catalog of types of poetry to hand in at the end. So they might check off, oh yeah, I wrote my haiku already, right? So here is an innovator project, an inventor project, and there's a little checklist here to make sure, not just for kids on the spectrum, but can every single kid remember that these are the elements that they need. So if you're interested in checklists in particular and all of the wonderful potential uses of checklists, I have a YouTube channel, which I'm going to show you a visual of later. And the YouTube channel, you can subscribe to it if you want, but you don't have to watch the videos. But the YouTube channel has a bunch of little 5 to 7 7-minute videos, and you can sort of, sample different topics. And one of the last ones I did was on checklists. And so you can now download all kinds of checklists, some that are related to curriculum and instruction, but also there's one, I think, on that video for feeding the class pet. So that one's not necessarily curriculum and instruction, but it's tangential. And so I give some ideas for how you might use these, again, not just to help kids get organized, but also connecting these checklists to standards-based instruction. So think about that one. Okay. Let's take some time to talk about communication, access, practice, and supports, because this is a biggie. And what I see for a lot of kids is if students don't have, if students do have reliable communication, I'll say that, we sometimes think that we don't have to consider much around access and support. But even for kids that are able to express themselves fairly easily, and we want to make sure that we're giving them multiple opportunities to do that and to do it in ways that are appropriate. So let me give you a couple of ideas in this category. One big idea, but lots of ideas underneath it. So one of my favorite ideas that I try to share with every group that I'm presenting to when I'm presenting about autism is indirect communication. And that's something I discovered when I was researching this book. I had read maybe about 30 to 50 autobiographies at that time. And I kept noticing examples of people on the spectrum talking about the comfort that they felt when they could back away from a really direct experience. The most direct conversational, approach would be getting very close to somebody and then looking them straight in the eyes. And so we know for a lot of our kids that when we look them straight in the eyes and we get very close, that might not only cause a lot of anxiety, but it can actually create an experience where you get the opposite of what you're looking for. If you want students a lot of students that experience some struggles there, if you want them to be able to listen, you may have to employ some of these indirect communication techniques. So indirect means moving away from some of those the norms that we grew up knowing about when we were learning about communication, and actually employing something like gaze avoidance. So gaze avoidance is exactly what it sounds like. It's instead of gazing at someone in the eyes when you're asking and answering questions or trying to give a piece of information, it means averting your gaze. So I always give the example, if I'm your 6th grade teacher and I'm looking at you've just created this diagram for me and we are looking at your work together, instead of looking at you and telling you what you need to know, I might put the paper out to the side and we both look at it, explore it together without having to face one another. And for a lot of kids, that will not only help them to listen easier, but you might see some of the anxiety come down for learners that have those struggles. Indirect communication could in any way might disrupt the idea of just us kind of in that back and forth dynamic, especially when it comes to things like proximity and really predictable norms of conversation. So some of these might be things like, let me go ahead here. Singing for young children. I know there's teachers out there that have said, boy, when I use a sing-song voice, all my kids really pay attention in a different way. So that's an indirect communication example, is using a sing-song voice. And I'll never forget reading an autobiography by a mom named Junie Waits, and said that she had a little preschooler, and she said, I used to sing all the chores to him and tell him, what he needed to do. And all of a sudden he would comply with everything. It was just easier for him to catch. It's not on the list here, and it's probably not an example of indirect communication, but another tip here would be using a whisper voice as a way to connect. So there's folks that have said that whisper is easier to grab onto. So when you're trying to get someone's attention, don't go higher, go a little bit lower. Another example of indirect communication would be like using a prop. So I've even had kids who just have some anxiety or shyness where we just bring in, a microphone from the dollar store, even in my college classrooms, and kids would present with the microphone. It just brought that sort of idea of I'm playing a role, I'm not me. It's easier to show up, especially in front of a group. Puppets for younger kids, even gestures. And I'll give one quick example of that. When my daughter was in about a preschool age, she had a really hard time interacting, well, a lot of kids do, but saying sorry to her sibling, when there was an incident. And we found out very quickly that she could sign it much more easily. And instead of waiting for her to do what was needed in that situation, she could almost immediately sign sorry. And then she was taking Spanish lessons at the time, and we found that it was very easy for her to say lo siento and use it in Spanish. So, not confess, apologize in Spanish. Another example, right, of bringing in this more indirect way of being in the world, in the interaction. So try some of those with students. Other quick examples of this would be things like using Facebook, Edmodo, Flipgrid, where kids can make a little video. My colleague, Judy Enzow, has said that things like Facebook, Edmodo, those are really powerful for her because she's on the spectrum, and she said, I can take my time to craft my answer. I can respond to humor in a different way. When she's one-on-one with somebody, people may think that she's not having a great sense of humor because she's not immediately laughing. And it may be because her affect is hard. It's hard for her she has a flatter affect at times, and it's harder for her to interpret the jokes quickly. So I just think that's a really powerful example from Judy, who's so smart and so helpful at exporting these ideas. If you're interested in this, this work, in particular, thinking about the eye contact bit, there is a lot of emerging research in this area, and some of it's been out for quite a while. But what we are finding is that that students are not engaging in eye gaze because they don't want to pay attention or because they're disinterested, is oftentimes because they are avoiding something that is very unpleasant, and often they are, if you look at the quote here, they are decreasing an unpleasant excessive arousal stemming from overactivation in part of the brain. It is uncomfortable, and some folks even say it's scary. So letting kids, not forcing eye contact is absolutely critical. And especially when kids are in that learning mode, we have to decide if they, what do we want them to do? Is it more important that they look right over here right now? Or is it important that they listen to what we're trying to teach about this equation, for example? Really, really important. And if you don't believe me, go to the experts, because individuals on the autism spectrum will tell us this again and again, and they're the ones that really brought it, I think, to our attention in the very beginning of this, looking at this issue. Another idea is really thinking about, I'm going to go back just a couple of slides so I don't forget the three ideas, is teaching augmentative communication to everybody, another helpful hint. So that means that if some kids are using sign language, it's not enough for us just to respond to the signs that they're sharing with us, that we also would want to sign back to them if possible. So if you have students who are using a range of signs, not only is it helpful to teach it to other kids in the classroom so that they may initiate with those systems and those symbols, but also that we might integrate some of those into our instruction. So if one student's using augmentative communication, are there opportunities for other kids to do that? If one kid is using a board maker symbols as a way to ask and answer questions related to a story, can the teacher have those same symbols at the front of the classroom when those concepts are being taught? The best work on this, at least for me, has been Michael McSheehan, Cheryl Jorgensen, also Brooks authors, who have written a lot about this with their presumed competence, their models, and thinking about supporting kids that use augmentative communication. If one kid is using this, how do we bring symbols and techniques into the classroom? So I like that idea. If a kid's coming in every day and accessing a switch or an app to greet peers, have peers greet that child, not necessarily with their voices, but have them first try by accessing the device or the same app so that students are seeing models of other kids using those systems. It helps with fluency. And for those of you that may not know, augmentative and AAC is augmentative and alternative communication. For those of you that don't know that language, so anything that supplements or is an addition to speech for learners. And then finally, I just wanted to give you a little resource here that you can get in the archives. And it's from the book. It's just a worksheet called Communication Opportunities Across the School Day. And it's essentially all kinds of, if you are a special ed teacher in particular, because that was my role, and I'm interacting with a colleague, and one of the things that I might recommend in this arena is that you've got to give kids a lot of opportunities to communicate, connect, interact, so that you cannot learn communication skills unless there are lots of communication opportunities. So when I'm meeting with somebody new, like a general ed teacher, I might say, here's all kinds of ways that kids with and without disabilities can be interacting in the course of lessons all day long, K-12. And so something like, turning and talking, going around the classroom and everybody shares something new or good in their life, having students, engaging in certain kinds of cooperative or small group types of instruction. So there's a whole list of options that you might use in the context of teaching a lesson. And then I go through with the teacher and I say, okay, that would really help my student because he needs to work on using his new sign language vocabulary, or he's working on using these new symbols, or he's got a new system, or he needs practice with it, or he needs help just using an audible voice in the classroom or speaking in a complete sentence. And so I can actually go through and say, is this something that you could do every day so that he could get that practice? Is this something that you'd be willing to do every week? And then we can talk together about, okay, sure, I'd be willing to do that weekly, but help me think about how that would fit into math class. And so then we generate together, how about having kids at the end of every day turn and share with a partner what's the most important thing that they learned in this class, in this hour, or something like that. So it's good for all kids because we know it helps with the meaning making. It's a good UDL strategy because we're kind of taking a pulse, we're checking in, but it's also good for kids that need lots of practice with communication. So that's something that you can all go grab from the archives, and thank you to Sharon for doing that for us. All right, so a webinar from me would not be complete unless I talked about fascinations, interests, special interest areas. So years ago when I was first teaching, it wasn't really a thing. I mean, I was told by, not necessarily by the leaders in my district, but I was told, from, textbooks and from consultants, certainly, that what my job was to do is if kids talked about something too often, I should maybe take away a privilege. I was told once that I could start a student with 5 basketball cards in the morning, and if he kept talking about basketball, I would take one away, and I would keep doing that all day long until they were gone. And it made for a horrible day for him, and it was a hideous day for me too. And I thought, this is not the way to go. So later when I was studying autism, again, hearing from folks on the spectrum, they were saying, you got to use the interests. Temple was saying it. Donna Williams was saying it. Stephen Shore was saying it. And anybody that had written at the time was talking about this. So I wrote a book with my wonderful colleague, Dr. Patrick Schwartz, who was also my first boss. We wrote 2 books, actually. We wrote a children's book called Pedro's Whale, which is doesn't say that it's about autism, but it's a story about a child who needs their whale. And we read it to young children, and it talks about how helpful it is for Pedro to have his whale, how comforting, and how it helps him learn. And we had written the teaching guide, and it's 20 different ways to use fascinations in the classroom. So some teachers say, I love the idea, but what do you do with this particular interest? Or I need some ideas. So we said, okay, here's 20 ways you can do it. And so we've got all kinds of tools, and we've got all kinds of strategies that you can employ. And here are just a couple of those things. This is a student who absolutely loves game shows, and in particular, Wheel of Fortune. And so we made him a little Shutterfly book. The first year I knew him, we made just an alphabet book where it was Q is for question, S is for solve. But as he got older, we were able to add to it. So then the next year there was maybe 2 sentences, and then maybe there were 3 sentences, and then he could make his own book. So that, and what you see here is that you still have to engage in independent reading. You can't just do what you're going to do and just watch Wheel of Fortune or look at Wheel of Fortune images. So this is it's what I say. It's the bridge versus the carrot. The carrot says, if you do all your work, I will let you look at your Wheel of Fortune pictures. The bridge says, is there a way to actually use that fascination as the bridge, that using it here? And the best analogy I can give is when my child was about 5 years old, she loved Dora the Explorer. She was also really hard to get to bed. So we used Dora for everything. We used Dora for, there was Dora toothpaste and Dora toothbrush and a Dora step stool and Dora bubble bath and a Dora nightgown and a Dora bed sheets and Dora comforter. And Dora so we do all these things. And if I had said, if you do your routine, I'll read you a story about Dora, I think it would have been much more of a struggle. But because Dora was the bridge, we would get her there and then we would read the Dora story and turn off the Dora nightlight and go to bed. And I always say, who wins in that scenario? She wins and I win, right? It's not letting her win. And so what you're thinking about is, how do I parlay this into something that can work? So it's not always as easy as Dora, that's for darn sure. And that's why we wrote the book, to try to give lots of different ideas about what this can look like. One of the things that I want to kind of share here is how to create some experiences for kids who may need some creativity, in the development. So this example helps me talk to that a little bit. This is a kid who loved the show Mad Men, which is about offices, marketing, advertising in the 1960s. And so we put all of his SAT vocabulary on a Rolodex. He liked adding machines, things like that. And kids helped us come up with a lot of this. So there's an example of this is a little strange, aside from just making sure that he can't have a cigarette at school. We can't do that. He's not going to, necessarily, we can't make this into an office, but what can we do? What can we do? And some of the kids are really helpful. The other thing you can do is, if you're finding that your student, that doesn't have an age appropriate interest, which happens a lot, is I often find for those kids, it's because they have not had enough exposure to peers without disabilities. And so it's not always the case, but when I hear that from folks, I'll say, well, how could you engineer him getting ideas for new interests? I know for my kids, they get their new interests from their peers. And so for young children, we might do some versions of show and tell, where kids, talk about what are they interested in right now, what's their favorite cartoon or their show, what book are they reading, what are they watching on television. And for older kids, we look for opportunities for this as well. What are informal ways for them to connect? So it might just be that at the end, we're having them turn and talk about, as I said, the math learning and lesson of that day. But then we might also have students go around the classroom and just hear from them, like, hey, what's on your iPad? What's on your iPod right now? I don't know if kids really have iPods, or just what's on your phone for music, but what are you listening to? And I find for a lot of kids, they just haven't had a lot of exposure to other kids their age. So that's a way to kind of help kids develop new, interesting, and age-appropriate fascinations. This one pains me as a Green Bay Packer fan, so forgive me. Kathy, my friend, lives listening in Green Bay, but this is a student did not have the Packer interest, but had the Patriots interest. So these are really just great little math cards with some of the standards that were connected to an IEP and also to the standards in his math classroom. And these were some of the kinds of problems that he would solve. It was part of a center, and the teacher and the paraprofessional would change up some of that learning. And oftentimes they found that they didn't even have to make anything too fancy, if you will, but that was enough to just sometimes affix a couple New England Patriots stickers to the things that he was studying, even to an assessment or something like that. And so what I put in here was a little strength-based curriculum map. So what's your student into, right? So if your student this is a kid that's into weather, a little bit older student. Some of you have students that have, something that's really hard to plan around. So one of my favorite stories is that I worked with a student, this is many years ago, and the teacher was stumped because his fascination was Eric Estrada from the television show Chips. That was very hard to plan around. They had to be creative. So it helps to go to a map like this, what we call a strength-based curriculum map. And these are not even all the categories that you might feature. You could come up with anything. You could say, we want to look at specific literacy skills related to reading and not just language arts. You might want to look at, this kid is taking a film class. What could you do with film? So it's really up to you. And we just sat there and, I find you get a couple people at the table, potentially the student, maybe a peer, a teacher, a family member, and we all just sit around and say, okay, Here's a fascination. Let's just throw out possibilities. It doesn't mean you have to use everything. And I'll remember this social studies teacher in this group was a little bit stumped, and the art teacher was just, don't you love art teachers, was just, I mean, we couldn't get her to stop talking. She had so many good ideas. We're going to make rain sticks. Every time I feature certain artists, I'm going to show a painting of weather, that has a weather influence. The speech path said, you know what? I have such a hard time with him learning new menus. I'm going to start with this weather menu to get him interacting and asking questions and so on. But the social studies teacher was a little stumped. And finally, at the end of the meeting, he said, I know. He said, D-Day was almost, didn't go forward because of weather. And I said, right. And I said, you don't have to use it all the time. I said, but even every now and then, I call it tipping the hat to a kid and saying, I see you. Hey, did you know, Darren, that D-Day was almost, it almost didn't go forward because of weather. And here this kid feels like, wow, this teacher sees me. In the book, in The Whale, Just Give Him the Whale, we write about a kid who said that he absolutely loved John Deere, and he was kind of disrupting the middle school class at times. And he had one social studies teacher that bought him a little John Deere notebook and said, I can't, talk. I know you love John Deere, and even asked him for a little mini lesson on John Deere. But he said, when you're in my class, I really need to talk about social studies because that's my passion. So when I'm teaching social studies, if there's something about John Deere that you want to share with me, could you just put it in this notebook? And then I could read that. And then I can, after if there's a couple comments in there, I can respond to you. And that made such an impact for this kid. And when his mother asked him later, why do you think you get along so well with this teacher? He said, well, we both love tractors. And that was not true, of course. It was that that this teacher took the time to say, I see you. I care about you. Okay. So just some ideas there. I just found this from eParent on Twitter. Just so neat. I was on Twitter one day and somebody made the comment, I think they were a therapist or something, but somebody said, I recommend never using fascinations unless they're going to directly connect to somebody's job. And boy, oh boy, that wasn't out there for a couple of minutes, but all these folks, all these autistic adults and folks on the spectrum just jumped on and said, whoa, that is not true. Please don't do that. My passion has saved my life. My fascination has calmed me down. I am my fascination. So I thought, wow, it's so great we have these voices of folks that are true experts and they can tell us about why that viewpoint is so critical. So that's really neat. 700 hours it took him. Fascinating. Okay. A resource that I wanted to share with some of you, I know many of you are going to take this back and they're going to share it with other colleagues, or you're already doing some of that, is this is a beautiful study that is done by a woman who's a mom, and she is also a researcher, clearly. Her name's Marianne Winter-Messiers, and she wrote this study, engaged in a study called From Tarantulas to Toilet Brushes. And you should get this study just for the name alone. But she did something so gorgeous for us as a researcher. What she did was she looked at about a couple of dozen, no more than 24 individuals on the spectrum and their families, and she interviewed them. And what she found was when individuals interacted with their SIAs, and that means special interest area, when they interacted with the things that they loved, be it trains or weather, pirates, ceiling fans, that when they were spending time with or reading about or connecting to or engaged in an activity around, that oftentimes the things that were challenges melted away or were much less of a problem, or that kids made gains in some of those areas as a result of interacting. So for an example of that, kids that would have a sensory issue, like they cannot tolerate, say, certain kinds of smells. They can't be in the art room because it's overwhelming. But interestingly, what individuals reported is if I am in pursuit of a fascination, I am able to cope. It gives me what I need to cope. So that there are kids that we know that are in 4-H. They will cope through being at the barnyard, which smells terrible. They will go and the smells of airplane glue, the craft glue, you know what I'm saying, model airplane glue, things that you wouldn't think somebody could tolerate, that they will communicate. They will be more fluent in their communication. They will make connections with other people. They may not want to be out in a crowded area, but if I get to go to that convention and learn about My Little Ponies, that I'll do it. And that's actually, there's a documentary about individuals that love My Little Pony. There's actually a really great documentary about bronies, which are boys and men that are interested in My Little Pony and love anime. And there's a young man who loves all that anime, loves those kinds of movies. And he said it was very hard for him, but he took all these risks, went on public transportation. And it really was neat and enlightening to see all he was able to tackle of his anxieties in pursuit of something he cared about. So it's really important as a tool. And I just love that particular study. So again, if you want to know more, you can hear me talking about this on that YouTube channel. The checklist idea is out there. They're Just Give Them the Whale, planning from fascinations. It's all on that YouTube channel, and you can see right there what it looks like. And there's like a little subscribe button. And if you subscribe, we send you the videos as we drop them in. But you can even go and visit without subscribing, and you can share them with other people, and you can use them in your in-service. They're just, that's what they're there for. There's also a short article about it. So if you don't have access, if your library, the library should have these books too, right? If you want to just take a look at them and you don't have access to them any other way. But there's also a short article on my website. So my website is just my name, paulakluth.com. And if you go to that purple readings tab, you're going to see an article called Thank You, Bob Barker, which you can guess what that's about. Someone who loves the old Price is Right. And it's about this sensibility of using fascinations. All right, so my time is pretty much here at the end. I could not end this webinar without saying that everything I've learned from families and from individuals on the spectrum themselves. And there are ways to not only learn. For example, I have a Pinterest page. Here are some of my social media. I just want to show that. Here's my Pinterest page where I have a bunch of tools. I'm on Twitter. Love for you to join me there. I'm on Facebook, and I have the website. And I have a little bit on Instagram, but not too much. But I'm sharing this because the Pinterest page is one place that you can learn about a lot of these autobiographies. I don't have them all pinned, but I do have a board of some of my favorites. I need to go add more, but you can learn an awful lot from families and from our students, and hopefully from the students themselves. So you might have a kid come to the meeting with a small report. If you work with young children, Stephen Shore, my colleague, has talked about this a lot. Every kid can bring something to their meetings. They can bring a photograph of something that they accomplished this year. Some young kids, even kids with not very reliable communication, can advance the slideshow and show some of the things that are their favorites. Older kids can come to their meeting and submit a little report like this one submitted by Rocco. And so this is the third kid I've known. His fascination is Ozzy Osbourne, the third. But he submitted this report. I want to be in chess club. I want to be in chess. I want to create chess scholars. I don't like Spanish. It's too hot. I want more Ozzy Osbourne in my day. It's just delightful actually to see this. And some quick other ideas for turning to the experts would be things like having kids make some quick videos, maybe that are 5 minutes, where the teachers can help them edit. There's so many great tools out there where they can actually give a little 5-minute talk about things that they need from their teachers. That's a way to turn to the expert. And those video clips can be added to every year. Hey, this is when teachers do this for me, it really helps me. Hey, here are some tips. The best thing a teacher ever did for me was this. Some districts put kids on a panel at least once a year, those that can do those things, and they have them teach the teachers. So some parents use pamphlets and one-pager. So think about, is there any idea here that you haven't tried with turning to the experts? And of course, one of my favorites is, of course, just going to families and saying, even if it's mid-year, anything else that I should know? Any other tips for me? How are you feeling? And I even had one of my favorite strategies was a parent who couldn't come in the classroom because if she did, her son would push her out because he didn't belong there. She didn't belong there in the day to him. So I would video clip certain segments that were, I wanted to problem solve, and she would watch him and we brainstorm them together. And I know so many families would love that opportunity, so parents, my colleague Patrick Schwartz says parents are the gold standard. I couldn't agree more. So again, there's the social media ideas. There's the website if you're looking for that. And those are the texts that I primarily drew from here. But if there are other images that we pulled from other texts, like text maps to memory caps and things like that, I've cited those in the presentation and Pedro's whale and things like that.